guest today is Jocelyn Bamford, a successful Ontario businesswoman. We're going to explore what it was like to run a business under the premiership of Premier Wynne and Premier Dalton McGuinty, both of whom were some of the most ferocious addicts of greenism that this continent has seen. Jocelyn, let's go back a little bit. At one point, especially in the middle governance of Dalton McGuinty, and propelled even higher by his successor, Kathleen Wynne, Ontario bragged that it was going to be one of the leading supporters of the fight against global warming, and that meant it brought in a green energy policy that was very, very comprehensive. As a businesswoman, how much introduction to that thinking did you have before they brought it in?
So we had zero introduction to it. We were forced into it, and when we were forced into it, and ended up paying 3 times the rate for electricity. So the going rate for electricity in North America is anywhere between 4 and 7 cents. My company pays 22 cents a kilowatt hour. And the result of that was from the green energy policy, where Dalton McGuinty and Jerry Butts and Kathleen Wynne decided they were going to put this plan together, and then they went out and paid people that had wind and solar contracts anywhere between 70 and 90 cents a kilowatt hour. So it was a pyramid of extortion, I felt, for the ratepayer, where the small to medium-sized business ended up paying the bill.
I'm going to break that down a bit more. From 7 to 23 for a small company, that's a really big multiplier. Why was it necessary, from the government's perspective, to jack it that much? What were they buying with your money?
So somebody had to pay for it, and we were the easy target. Where a lot of us are small to medium-sized business, we don't have dedicated people looking at our electricity bill because it's a monopoly service. I have to buy my electricity from Toronto Hydro. I don't have a choice who I can pick my electricity for. So there was one thing that started to creep up called the global adjustment charge. So on a $40,000 a month bill, I could see $25,000 going to global adjustment, and no one could explain to me.
$25,000 down to $40,000.
Absolutely, and then a $10,000 delivery fee. So my electricity portion wasn't that high, but they put in all these other charges that made it very difficult for me to compete. I could move my business just across the states to New York, and I could save $300,000 annually on my electricity bill. And that I'm not an anomaly. That's the way it is for most of us in the small to medium-sized space.
I asked you when they explained it, and you explained that they didn't explain it. At some point, though, during this process, when a whole host of medium-sized businesses are being introduced to this wholly new and extravagant expense, did you ever have any sympathy for what, at least from their mouths, was the idealism behind this, that we have to make Ontario a classic example to the rest of the world by somehow or other forcing renewables into the system? Ever have any sympathy for that?
So what I have sympathy for is small to medium-sized business that are just trying to survive and keep their people employed. And if you drive them out with ideological policies, you're not going to do anything for the citizens of your country. So when I look at the Canadian landscape for energy, we have the cleanest energy. We contribute the least amount of greenhouse gases of any large industrialized country. 1.6% of the world's greenhouse gases come from Canada, so we're doing our part. And when I look at manufacturing in Ontario specifically, we've driven down our greenhouse gases 55%. So why would you have to bring in new technology when we're already doing our part? And why would you want to make it so difficult for your job creators to be able to compete? Because we compete in a global marketplace. And remember, every job, every road, every hospital, every school is funded from business. We employ people who pay taxes and that are allowed to allow us to have the services. So bringing in ideological technology, which has proven to not be efficient. You just have to walk outside in the winter in Ontario to see we don't get a lot of light here. So to bring in inefficient technology that hasn't been proven just to score points on the global stage is not the right thing for the citizens.
This is outside of the, not outside of it exactly, but it's outside the pure business experience. There was another element towards, I believe, the end of term for Premier Wynne, when, because the cost of power to households was so high that in one winter, I hope my reading is correct and I'll check it later, I think it was something like 40,000 households for some while got cut off with power. And secondly, that the government which constructed these raised rates then went into the taxes to give subsidies back to the people that they had taxed too highly. Elaborate that for me.
So a lot of the things that come into that global adjustment pays a lot of the different fees. If you have a refrigerator and you want to upgrade and you get a rebate, that comes out of that fund. So the burden on global adjustment goes to small to medium-sized business, and it doesn't go to all businesses equally. Some of the large businesses get a break on an industrial energy rate, and I don't begrudge them, but then you can't put all of the balance of all of those social programs and the Green Energy Act on another group of industry to make it be uncompetitive, because otherwise you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and you're hurting the economy. And remember that if you look at businesses in Canada, 92% of all businesses are 100 people and below. So there's a big group of us that drive the economy, and we're the group that is being either driven into bankruptcy, driven out of the country, and people are moving their businesses because it's more cost effective. And it's not just that. The government are putting businesses in a position that they have to pick between their long-term employees that they love and the viability of their business. And what government puts their job creators in a situation like that? They have to pick between the guy that's worked for them for 20 years and the company staying viable. And then the other thing we saw was businesses, if they didn't just move outright, they moved their growth. So they could have grown here, and there's a lot of examples, but they chose to grow in another jurisdiction because we're not competitive.
In your own particular case, your company's around for a long while. Did you either explore the possibility of leaving Ontario, or did you ever have any invitations to do so?
We do. We have invitations all the time. And at one point, before we started the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses, when cap and trade came in, and when I found out that that was going to cost us $50,000 off our bottom line, and when I looked at my electricity and found out that I could save $300,000 a year by moving, and when Bill 148 came in, and it wasn't, we didn't pay anyone minimum wage. We're a manufacturer, we need skilled laborers, but we had to cover, the skilled trades expect to be paid a certain percentage over minimum wage. So when you raise minimum wage very quickly,
you raise that too.
You raise everybody. So that cost $600,000. So when I added all that up, at one point I looked at my husband, I said, maybe we should consider moving. And he looked at me and he said, do you want to just get up and leave, or do you want to stay and fight? So we decided that we were going to stay and fight, not just for us and our family, but for all of our employees and their families.
Is there any jurisdiction in Canada compared with Ontario during the period we're talking about that would have had, just within Canada now, that would have had a superior environment for business?
So electricity rates are, there are a lot of provinces that have competitive electricity rates. Ontario is the one that has the most expensive electricity rates. So we could have moved again to another location, another province. But again, then we'd be abandoning the workers that have worked for us for so long.
What was your perception? All these new things are coming in, but they're coming in, and I'm going back to the original point, they're coming in under this great new drive that, according to its progenitors, the premiers, this is the most moral thing. We are saving the world. We're fully on side with Paris and Copenhagen. This is such a moral crusade that any injury it may do by the side is insignificant to the size of the goal. What do you think when you hear those things?
So when I think of those things, I think we ought to run our policy by fact and by looking at the statistics. And when I look again that Canada contributes 1.6% of the world's greenhouse gases, we're not the problem. So what I often say, it's like having gastric bypass surgery because your friend is obese. We should help our friend who is obese drive their greenhouse gases down and do whatever we can to support them. But we don't need to do that here. We need to help our citizens be able to grow, because what happens if, as businesses leave and take their jobs with them, then we're going to have less ability to do anything. Services, schools, even the environment. We're not going to be able to contribute to those things.
I'm moving to another stage, but I'm going to put in a proviso here. That's if you accept the apocalyptic and millennium view that if you don't do this thing here, we don't have $50 carbon tax, the world is going to explode tomorrow morning. That's a lot more open question than anything. The presumption for all of these policies is held with the certainty of a messianic faith more than anything else. And to question it even is supposedly off grounds. But even if you accept their view of things, which is what you were doing just now, the ability of Canada to change a global fate just doesn't exist. So now I move to the second stage. In Ottawa, governments change too. And some of the progenitors of the plan in Ontario, certainly the main thinkers, and I use the word very loosely, transferred their many skills to the back rooms of Mr. Trudeau, who has adopted an environmental policy that is every bit as intense and feverish as anything you saw in Ontario. So does that still keep the strings on the businesses of this province?
Absolutely, and my biggest concern is for every policy that we get relief from provincially, it's come back federally. So we saw cap and trade go away. We saw carbon tax come in, and that carbon tax is going to cost my company $50,000, going up to over $200,000. And when I have said to some policy advisors in the previous Liberal government and provincially, where do you think we're going to come up with this money? And do you know what they said back to me?
No.
You guys will figure it out. And I said to him, we'll figure it out, but some of us are figuring it out in the United States or in Mexico or other places. And it's not their first choice. They've been driven by policy to do that.
There's a great irony in all of this that insubstantially noted, I will tell you, is that President Trump, is not with the Paris agreements at all. Secondly, the United States is now the world's leading supplier of oil and gas, thanks to the shale revolution in the main. It does not have a regime of carbon taxes whatsoever, but the punchline is that the emissions levels, if you buy that stuff, the emissions levels of the states are much lower. They are the leading lower of these great carbon emissions, and yet they belong to none of the state-sanctified programs that we have up here. In other words, the country not in the Paris Accord and without a carbon tax is leading in the reduction of carbon emissions. The country that has all the virtue on its side is behind the United States.
Right. And we saw that in Ontario, where through innovation, we drove down our greenhouse gases. Because let's face it, if you're a business owner and one of your large costs is energy, you do whatever you can to drive that cost down, and that will help your bottom line. So we're incentivized already to do what we can to not only help the environment, but also to help our bottom line. So to add taxes onto it, and it is a tax. And,
of course it is.
And it's a tax that's not going to do anything. We're destroying our resource sector, which in turn destroys our manufacturing sector. Because if you think about projects that are in the resource sector, somebody fabricates it. A lot of times somebody in Ontario fabricates it. And then they have to paint that piece. And so somebody coats it. And then they put it on a truck, and a truck driver drives it across the province to where the project is. And they stop in several provinces and they eat, and maybe they stay at a hotel, or maybe they stop and buy a gift for their family. And so it really is an ecosystem. And for the federal government to decide that they're going to take down the resource sector, then they're going to take down manufacturing, and then they're also attack the plastic sector. And when you attack the plastic sector, you attack the food services sector, because let's face it, one of our members is the freezing manufacturer. And what are you going to put your freezing in if you ban the single-use plastics? They're going to be walking around with a large jar. How are they going to compete on the world stage? I mean, it's sheer lunacy, and it's time for businesses to band together and really push back against some of these policies that are not going to help the citizens of our country.
But once again, we said it within the context of Ontario that it was a kind of virtue posturing. I heard the phrase 1,000 times that Ontario will lead the world in the fight against climate change. And now you just got to hop over to Ottawa and it's Canada is leading the world in the fight against climate change. Of course it isn't. It's not China, it's not Indonesia, it's not India, it's not South America, it's not Africa. Our contribution, if any, is purely symbolical and purely to signal that we're virtuous. And in your opinion, do you think India, China, Russia, and Indonesia are paying any attention whatsoever to the carbon tax in Canada?
Absolutely not. And they I honestly believe they're happy, because if we take down our resource sector, that's one less competitor for them. And so what I don't understand is a federal government that doesn't look after its citizens, that doesn't look after jobs, that doesn't make sure that our children are going to have jobs. And what do we get in exchange? They get to go on the world stage and make these claims that aren't true. It's lunacy, and I don't understand why more people don't stand up against it. I started this coalition for the sole purpose that I want to make sure my children have a job, and I want to make sure that my employees still have a job to come to.
Outside of the ideology, here's another point. Ontario was always celebrated for its manufacturing. If you have a tax regime in the States that is superior to business than in Ontario, if you have an oil and gas understanding that doesn't penalize the use of energy, if you can get pipelines to flow down there when you want, if they're producing more than any other country in the world and just can feed their own market so very easily, how much competition does that represent to someone in this jurisdiction?
Yeah, absolutely. As businesses leave and companies flee, and we're not competitive because we can't produce our product because our energy isn't affordable, that drives that competition down. So they're really securing their future at the cost of our future. And it used to be back 50, 100 years ago, that when politicians had an idea, they got together with businesses and they jointly worked on how do you get to that point in a way that
doesn't slaughter things on way.
Right, and that has gone away. And politicians have forgot that they work for us. We put them there to support us, but somehow that has completely turned on its head, and they think we work for them. The demand for resources is going up. It's not going down, and it's going up globally as other countries become industrialized. And so would we rather that they buy their energy from Venezuela or Saudi Arabia, or would we rather them buy our clean energy for us, where we have environmental protection, where our citizens are paid a fair wage? Those are the things that we should be doing. And in addition, we can become the solution to reducing global greenhouse gases. So if the federal government was really concerned about driving down global greenhouse gases, they would allow us to get our product across and out of our country to other industrialized countries and help them reduce their greenhouse gases.
It is truly one of the wonders of this argument, and you have to smile at it, that one of the great oppositions to the pipeline expansion, whenever it happens, comes out of Quebec, and we don't like oil and gas. And yet you have tankers crossing the great Atlantic Ocean and going all the way up to the ports of Montreal, to the same place where they say, I don't want it coming over from Calgary. How can you How can you occupy those two thoughts in your mind at the same time?
Because they're not really concerned with the global climate issues. They're really just concerned about their adherence to this religion that everybody has to follow the same path. We don't have to follow the same path because we have a different contribution to the world's greenhouse gases. We have different environmental standards.
We're a different country.
We're a different country, and we have different citizens. And our first priority should be looking after the citizens of our country. And it is a great country.
Why do you think that this particular, it is semi-religious, by the way, among some people, I think it's a cult. Not all. I also think that it's advanced with far more intensity than the information that is behind it. The information is controlled, the science is monitored, and it's more advocacy than it is rationality. But nonetheless, as a staple of conversation and as an attitude fixer, global warming is, oh, this is so important, so serious, and we're going out now, we're going to send the school children out and bar the school doors for a couple of days. How did it get into people's minds so deeply? And at the same time, at any level of effectiveness, they're not doing anything about it. There's no 2 cars disappearing. Mr. Trudeau's going to go all over the world wherever he wants. It's a climate crisis, we were told, by an act of Parliament. Did anything happen because of that? So how did it enter so strongly into the thoughts of so many people, especially young people?
Well, and I have 3 children, 12, 14, and 16, and they've been through the public school system, and it really is frightening what they're taught, and it is an indoctrination. And I remember when I went to school, if there were any discussions on politics or policy, the teacher used to divide the class in 2 sides, and one group would research one thing and the other would research another thing, and then they would come together and both sides would be presented, and the children were able to make their own minds best on the best knowledge that they had. And that's not what's happened in education in the last 20 years, even probably in the last 30 years. There's now one narrative that's taught to everybody. Yeah. There's no dissension, there's no discussion, there's no debate. It is clearly an effort to indoctrinate people. Now, I have to take responsibility as a parent because a lot of parents we're so busy working, trying to keep food on the table that we haven't had time to get involved in all these things. And so the kids have been educated unchecked. And I know from spending 6 years on parent council, the one thing you're not allowed to discuss on parent council is the curriculum. Yeah. And so that's a frightening prospect. And we've let it happen. We've acquiesced our rights as parents. We've acquiesced our rights as business owners who provide the wealth to get social programs, and we've let politicians run unchecked. And it's time for us to band together and say no more, and to remind politicians that they work on our behalf, not the other way around.
Well, I'll probably wrap it up on this to a degree. One of the, I think, strange, other people may think it's wonderful, there's a 16-year-old who just came across, as we're doing this interview, who just came across the Atlantic on some high-powered sailboat because she didn't wish to fly and provide a bad example. She's obviously a greener of the deepest persuasion. She's been allowed to address parliaments. She's going to be addressing various political organizations and governments. When did we get to the point that some immature 16-year-old is now become a kind of consul for the world on its impending doom? And adults and newspapers and televisions not only listening, they're giving her serious time.
And it's because there's one of their prodigies that subscribe to their religion, and they're going to give them all the time that they can. And the reality is, we all have children and grandchildren. Everybody wants to do their part, and we have done our part to make sure that the world is sustainable. But we need policy based on rational thought and knowledge and statistics instead of ideology and feeling, and we need to have policies that support what's actually scientifically proven in an open forum. And so you can't make decisions if you only hear one side of the story.
Well, you can't make decisions if you're relying upon the expertise of a 16-year-old fanatic.